Proxemics is the study of how humans structure space in the practice of their daily lives, as defined by Edward Hall, the man considered to be the founder of Proxemics. It's also called the semiotics of space or spatial semiotics. Hall describes something called informal space, which is divided into intimate, personal, social, and public space. Intimate space is 2 feet and closer, personal space begins at 5 feet, social space at 9, and public space is anything beyond that range. The line between an individual's personal space and social space was of particular interest to Hall, and he emphasized the role of culture in this spatial construction. His theory was a starting point for a lot of the following research. He observed that proxemic behavior was performed on a highly unconscious level, and often the subjects of proxemic violation or annoyance were unaware of the origin of their reaction. Hall first noted the distinct differences between Arab and North American culture, which were distinctly considered contact and non-contact cultures. Hall theorized that the individual's proxemic parameters were ingrained by their culture. However, Hall never tested his theory, so while these observations seemed valid, he had no way of proving his theory. Because the use of proxemic space conveys meaning, it's an important aspect of communication, and it dictates how and if an individual is understood. It's estimated that only about 30 to 35% of the meaning of a conversation is conveyed through linguistic forms, through words. Non-native speakers or any international of any culture will be confronted by the issues raised in proxemic communication. They might master linguistic aspects, yet still struggle to be understood by the native speaker. Hall recognized that communication consisted of more than verbal interaction, inquiry into this hidden or unknown area of human behavior held and holds value because it explores an important aspect of human interaction. Studies in proxemics attempt to pinpoint the building blocks of proxemic behavior and to identify ways to overcome them. Without recognizing proxemic differences and attempting to compensate for them, international cooperation on any level becomes extremely difficult. The field of proxemics is of particular interest to those who deal directly with the merging of cultures. In the United States, this merger takes place all the time, on the streets, in stores, in schools. Educators, for instance, are constantly and consistently affected by cultural diversity, so an awareness of proxemic interpersonal communication is important to them. Proxemic behavior is also important to those in Christian ministry because they commonly interact with different cultures, and in order to serve them well, it's essential that they understand them well. If we're supposed to share the gospel with these people, then we need to make sure that the message we send is the message that's being received. Proxemic research explores some of the considerations which determine proxemic interaction, particularly the interaction between personal space and how that is negotiated and how people respond to each other within and outside of cultural groups. For non-Native Americans or for any transplanted group of language learners, recognizing that spatial behavior constitutes communication may be a key element for their successful mastery of the language and assimilation into a new culture. As Hall postulated, there is proxemic difference between cultures. However, he qualified his statement a little more than most of the research I read. He said that research should reveal a difference between contact cultures, those with high haptic or touch levels, and those with low haptic levels or non-contact cultures. All of the studies showed that proxemic preferences are tied to culture. However, they didn't note that there was a distinct difference in the distance maintained by all contact cultures in comparison with all non-contact groups. The difference was much less general and more culture-specific. Gender differences also surfaced in the studies I looked at. As a general rule, females, regardless of culture, maintained less personal space than the males of any culture. They needed less personal space to feel comfortable than did the males. Interesting, females seem to experience a proxemic curve in which at middle age they need less personal space than they do as young women or old women. As men age, they consistently became more direct. That is, they needed less space as they aged. Social status also plays a part in determining proxemic behavior. Interestingly, some studies showed that people who occupy lower social classes maintain lower spatial expectations than people from middle and upper classes, while others showed no distinct difference between classes. The real distinction seen in interaction between members of different statuses was when they interacted unequally. Individuals of unequal social status both allowed for greater differences than they would have among members of their own class. So unequal dyads or groups allowed for greater distance than equal dyads or groups. Social expectations of proxemic space also play a part in proxemic behavior. For example, those who attend a sporting event will expect to have their normal personal space bubble invaded. On the other hand, if you're in a library, patrons expect their personal space to be respected based on the cultural or social idea of a space. In addition, the stress or threat of a situation changes proxemic needs. If someone perceives a threat, the need for personal space will drastically increase with a high-stress situation. Talking about personal matters also increases the distance at which individuals felt comfortable because it was also a high-stress situation. Logically, the process of making somebody proxemically aware is done in the classroom. It's a formal location where the direct teaching of proxemics can occur. First, because the students have the ability to watch the model of the teacher, and they can do it in a safe space. Teachers also employ and have several tools which are available to them. First, a good dose of observation is in order. Students should go on field trips. They should watch movies. They should watch recordings of cultural interactions just to expose them to different proxemic patterns. Students also have to be able to recognize different proxemic behaviors in order to recognize the expectations and the communication which are embedded in them. Next, students should be asked to replicate unfamiliar proxemic behavior so they can start to gain a feel for these unseen bubbles which everyone has. Role plays are a perfect way to accomplish this because it forces the student to put themselves in the position of a different culture's proxemic expectations. Next, students are asked to disrupt their own proxemic expectations by reversing things like gender or status roles, based on depictions in media or in art. For example, a male would play the role of a female, or a high-status person would play the role of a panhandler or a beggar. Finally, as a true test of proxemic awareness, students are asked to create situations in which proxemics assigned to each individual in this scenario are completely wrong, so they can recognize what is right, but they can also recognize what is wrong. It helps them see and encourages them to recognize the invisible aspects of communication which happen all the time. So let's recap. Proxemics is the study of space in relationship to communications. Everyone has expectations for intimate, personal, social, and public space. These expectations are formed by a complex combination of culture, gender, status, and situation. Difference in cultural proxemics, since it's the situation that is least encountered in comparison to things like gender, status, and situational proxemics, is logically the most unfamiliar and difficult to naturally compensate for. So that means that raising proxemic awareness, which will help an individual recognize these invisible barriers, will help the language learner to overcome proxemic noise and allow them to be successfully understood. Unfortunately, the field of proxemics is still in its baby stages. It's only been around since the 1960s. Researchers still don't understand how all of these aspects combine to produce expectations of one individual, let alone a culture. They still have difficulty accounting for all of the variables and obtaining very exact measurements of personal distance. However, this field will continue to grow, and as a result, it will continue to inform our understanding and mold our understanding of communications.